The doorbell rang at 6 a.m. 3 angry knocks followed. I opened the door to find my neighbor Margaret with 2 police officers behind her. "This woman is living here illegally," she shouted, pointing at my wife. Sarah just smiled and pulled out her military ID. Margaret's face went white. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The pounding on my door at 6 a.m. wasn't how I'd planned to start my Saturday morning. 3 sharp, aggressive knocks that seemed to shake the entire cabin. I stumbled out of bed, still groggy from the late night I'd spent helping my wife Sarah unpack her belongings. She'd finally moved in with me after months of long-distance dating, and we'd celebrated until well past midnight. "Open up. This is harassment." The shrill voice cut through the morning air like nails on a chalkboard. I knew that voice. Margaret Henderson, the self-appointed queen of Pine Ridge HOA, had been a thorn in my side since I'd bought this cabin 6 months ago. But this was a new level of crazy even for her. I threw on a robe and opened the door to find Margaret standing there with her arms crossed, her perfectly coiffed silver hair not moving an inch despite the mountain breeze. Behind her stood 2 very tired-looking police officers who seemed like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Officers, this is the man I told you about," Margaret announced dramatically, pointing at me like I was some kind of criminal. "He's been harboring an unauthorized resident in violation of our HOA covenants." I blinked, trying to process what was happening. "Margaret, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me, David Chin," she snapped. "I saw that woman moving boxes into your cabin yesterday. Large boxes, multiple trips, clearly a permanent relocation. Section 4.7 of our HOA agreement clearly states that all new residents must be approved by the board before taking occupancy." One of the officers, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Sir, we're just responding to a complaint about a possible HOA violation. Is there someone new living here?" Before I could answer, I heard footsteps behind me. Sarah appeared at my shoulder, and I felt a surge of both pride and protectiveness. Even in her oversized army t-shirt and messy bun, she looked incredible. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set. My wife didn't handle confrontation well in civilian settings, not because she couldn't handle it, but because she was always afraid her military training would kick in and she'd respond with more force than the situation warranted. "Good morning, officers," Sarah said politely, her voice carefully controlled. "Is there a problem?" Margaret's eyes narrowed as she took in Sarah's appearance. I could practically see the gears turning in her head, cataloging every detail to use against us later. "Are you living here illegally?" she demanded. Sarah's hand found mine and I squeezed it gently. I knew what she was thinking. She'd spent the last 8 years dealing with actual problems, life and death situations in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now she was being interrogated about moving in with her husband by a woman whose biggest concern was whether someone's mailbox was the approved shade of brown. "Ma'am," Sarah said slowly, "I'm not living here illegally. I'm living here with my husband." The word husband hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her mouth dropped open then snapped shut. "Husband? You two aren't married. I've lived next to David for 6 months and there's been no wedding." I felt my own anger rising. "Actually, Margaret, we got married 3 weeks ago. Not that it's any of your business." This was true, though we'd kept it quiet. Sarah had been on deployment, and when she'd gotten her leave approved, we decided to have a small ceremony at the courthouse with just our immediate families. We'd planned to have a bigger celebration later, but with Sarah's military schedule, we'd wanted to make it official as soon as possible. "I want to see proof," Margaret shrieked. "Marriage certificate, HOA approval forms, everything. You can't just sneak people into our community." The second officer, a younger woman who looked like she was getting increasingly uncomfortable with Margaret's behavior, spoke up. "Ma'am, if they're married, then there's no violation here. A spouse doesn't need HOA approval to live with their partner." "But she wasn't on the original application," Margaret protested. "When David bought this cabin, he listed himself as single. This is fraud." I felt Sarah's grip tighten on my hand. I could see her breathing change, becoming more controlled, more measured. This was how she got when she was really angry, not explosive but absolutely still, like a predator deciding whether to strike. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "my marital status when I bought the cabin has nothing to do with my wife moving in now. People get married. It happens. Not without proper notification to the HOA board." Margaret shot back. "We have procedures for a reason. What if she's a criminal? What if she's dangerous? We don't know anything about her." That's when something shifted in Sarah's posture. I'd seen it before, The way she went from relaxed to absolutely ready for anything in the space of a heartbeat. The officers noticed it too. I saw them both straighten up slightly, their training recognizing something in Sarah's bearing that Margaret was completely oblivious to. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice dropping to that deadly quiet tone I'd heard her use exactly twice before. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Margaret, completely missing the warning signs, pressed on. "A misunderstanding? I'll tell you what's a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is thinking you can just waltz into our peaceful community without following proper procedures. Do you have any idea what kind of neighborhood this is? What kind of people live here?" The racist undertone wasn't lost on any of us. Pine Ridge was indeed an affluent, predominantly white community, and Margaret had made it clear from day one that she considered my presence there an anomaly that needed to be closely monitored. Now, with Sarah, who was half Latina and carried herself with an unmistakable military bearing, Margaret was practically vibrating with indignation. "Mrs. Henderson," the older officer interjected, "perhaps we should." "No." Margaret cut him off. "I want them both arrested for trespassing. For fraud. For violating HOA regulations." Sarah took a step forward and I felt the temperature in the air seem to drop 10 degrees. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." It wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone who'd commanded troops in combat zones, someone who was used to being obeyed without question. Margaret, however, was too wrapped up in her own self-righteous fury to recognize the danger she was walking into. "Don't you dare tell me what to do." Margaret shrieked, actually stepping closer to Sarah. "This is my neighborhood. I've lived here for 15 years. I won't be intimidated by some random woman who thinks she can just." She stopped mid-sentence. I followed her gaze and saw what had made her freeze. Sarah had pulled out her wallet to get our marriage certificate, and when she'd opened it, her military ID had fallen out onto the doorstep. It lay there in the morning sunlight, the eagle and shield emblem clearly visible, along with Sarah's rank and the words, United States Army. But it wasn't just any military ID. It was a CAC card, a common access card, and even Margaret, for all her ignorance, could see the special markings that indicated Sarah wasn't just any soldier. The card showed her rank as captain, but more importantly, it showed her unit designation, 75th Ranger Regiment. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something that might have been fear. Even she knew what the Rangers were. The older officer picked up the ID and examined it carefully before handing it back to Sarah with a respectful nod. "Thank you for your service, Captain." Sarah took the card back, and for the first time since this whole confrontation started, she smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate that." Margaret was backing away now, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. I didn't know. I mean, you didn't know what?" Sarah asked quietly. "You didn't know that I'm a decorated combat veteran? You didn't know that I've served 3 tours overseas defending the freedoms that allow you to live in your nice, safe neighborhood? Or you didn't know that maybe, just maybe, you should think twice before harassing people you know nothing about?" I watched Margaret's face cycle through emotions. The woman who'd been screaming about unauthorized residents and demanding arrests was now confronted with the reality that the dangerous stranger she'd been railing against was someone who'd literally put her life on the line for this country. "Mrs. Henderson," the younger officer said gently, "perhaps this would be a good time to head home. It seems like this was all just a misunderstanding." But Sarah wasn't done. 8 years of military discipline, of following orders and keeping her mouth shut when civilians disrespected her service, had finally found an outlet. Anne Margaret Henderson, HOA tyrant extraordinaire, was about to get the full force of Captain Sarah Chen's suppressed frustration. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, since you're so concerned about following proper procedures, let me share some information with you." Sarah's voice was conversational now, almost friendly, which somehow made it more terrifying. "See, I've been researching this HOA ever since David told me about some of the issues he's been having." Margaret's eyes widened. "Issues? What issues?" "Oh, you know. The complaint about his American flag being too large. The citation for having non-regulation wind chimes. The demand that he repaint his shutters because the blue was apparently not on the approved color palette." Sarah counted off on her fingers. "Funny thing is, I did some research on HOA law during my downtime overseas. Had a lot of free time between missions, you know." The officers were trying not to smile now. I could see them exchanging glances, clearly enjoying watching Margaret get a taste of her own medicine. "And what I found," Sarah continued, pulling a folder from inside the cabin, is that about 60% of the citations you've issued in the past year are actually legally baseless, including all the ones you gave my husband. Margaret's face had gone pale. That's not, you can't just. Oh, but I can. Sarah opened the folder, revealing what looked like a small mountain of paperwork. See, I may be a soldier, but I also have a degree in legal studies. And I've spent the last month going through every single HOA violation notice issued in this community for the past 2 years. She pulled out a thick stack of papers. Turns out, Mrs. Henderson, that you've been operating under the assumption that people won't fight back. That they'll just pay the fines and follow your arbitrary rules because it's easier than researching whether you actually have the authority to enforce them. Margaret tried to retreat another step, but she was already at the edge of my porch. Now see here. No, you see here. Sarah's voice cut through the air like a blade. You want to talk about unauthorized residence? Let's talk about your son Bradley, who's been living in your guest house for 8 months without being added to the HOA registry. You want to talk about property violations? Let's discuss the 6-foot privacy fence you installed last year without getting proper permits or HOA approval, a fence that's 8 inches taller than community regulations allow. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. How did you? That's private property. It's visible from the street, Mrs. Henderson. Just like the unauthorized security cameras you've installed that are pointed toward your neighbors' properties, which violates both HOA rules and state privacy laws. The younger officer was now openly grinning. The older one maintained his professional demeanor, but I could see the corners of his mouth twitching. Sarah wasn't finished. And then there's the matter of your position on the HOA board itself. According to the community bylaws, board members are supposed to be elected every 2 years. You've been serving as interim president for 4 years without a proper election. That's because no one else wanted the job. Margaret protested weakly. That's because you've systematically intimidated anyone who's tried to run against you, Sarah replied calmly. Like Mrs. Patterson, who withdrew her candidacy after you filed 17 different violation notices against her in 1 week. Or Mr. Rodriguez, who decided it wasn't worth the hassle after you started parking your car in front of his driveway and claiming it was a community street patrol. I stared at my wife in amazement. I'd known she was smart, but I hadn't realized she'd been conducting what was essentially a military intelligence operation against our HOA. Margaret was looking around desperately, as if searching for backup that wasn't coming. You can't prove any of this. Sarah smiled again, and this time it was genuinely warm. Actually, I can. See, Mrs. Henderson, the military taught me to be very thorough. When I identify a target, when I research a problem, I gather all available intelligence before taking action. She pulled out her phone and showed the screen to the officers. I've documented every violation notice issued in this community for the past 2 years, cross-referenced them with actual HOA regulations and state law, and compiled a comprehensive report. I've also gathered statements from 17 different neighbors about harassment and intimidation tactics. The older officer leaned forward to look at the phone. This is very thorough, Captain. Thank you, officer. In my line of work, attention to detail can be the difference between life and death. Turns out it's also pretty useful for dealing with civilian administrative challenges. Margaret had gone from pale to red to a sort of gray color that suggested she was finally understanding the magnitude of what she was facing. You can't. This is harassment. No, Mrs. Henderson, Sarah said quietly. Harassment is calling the police on a couple for the crime of being married. Harassment is issuing bogus violation notices to try to force people out of their homes. Harassment is targeting my husband with frivolous complaints because you don't think he belongs in your precious neighborhood. The emotion was creeping into Sarah's voice now, and I could see the real anger underneath her controlled exterior. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. This was about every time someone had questioned her right to be somewhere, every time her service had been dismissed or ignored, every time she'd had to prove herself to people who would never have to face the things she'd faced. You know what, Mrs. Henderson? Sarah continued, her voice getting stronger. I've spent the last 8 years of my life in places where people actually have something to be afraid of. I've dodged IEDs, returned fire under enemy contact, and led soldiers through some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. I've seen what real problems look like. She gestured around at the peaceful mountain community, with its pristine cabins and manicured landscaping. So when I come home to this beautiful, safe place that my husband chose for us to build our life together, and I find that you've been making his life miserable over the color of his shutters and the size of his flag, it makes me wonder what you think you're actually protecting here. Margaret opened her mouth, but Sarah held up a hand. I'm not finished. You called the police on us this morning because you assumed, without any evidence, that I was some kind of threat to your community. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong here. You made assumptions about who I am and what I represent without knowing anything about me. Sarah's voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. Do you want to know who I am, Mrs. Henderson? I'm someone who volunteered to put my life on the line so that you could sleep safely in your bed. I'm someone who's led rescue operations to save American civilians from hostile territory. I'm someone who's earned 3 commendations for valor and 2 Purple Hearts. The officers were standing at attention now, I realized. Without even thinking about it, they'd both straightened up in response to Sarah's obvious authority and experience. But more than that, Sarah continued, I'm someone who believes in the values this country is supposed to represent. Freedom, equality, the right to live peacefully without being harassed by petty tyrants who think they own the neighborhood. Margaret was crying now and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I didn't know, she whispered. The rules? The rules don't give you the right to terrorize your neighbors, Sarah said firmly. And they certainly don't give you the right to call the police on people for being married. The older officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, he said to Margaret, I think it would be best if you returned home now. And perhaps in the future, you might want to verify your facts before calling us out for HOA disputes. Margaret nodded weakly and started to turn away, then stopped. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean. Sarah studied her for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler. Mrs. Henderson, I understand that you care about this community. I can respect that. But caring about something doesn't give you the right to hurt people. And it doesn't mean you get to decide who belongs and who doesn't. After Margaret and the officers left, Sarah and I sat on our porch swing, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The anger had drained out of both of us, leaving behind a kind of exhausted relief. I'm sorry, I said finally. I should have handled Margaret better. I should have protected you from that. Sarah leaned against my shoulder. You didn't need to protect me from her, David. I can handle Margaret Henderson. What I couldn't handle was watching her treat you like that for 6 months without being able to do anything about it. You researched the HOA for me? She laughed, and the sound was like music after the morning's tension. Babe, I've been planning this operation since the 2nd week after you told me about her. Did you really think I was going to let some suburban dictator push my husband around? I kissed the top of her head. I love you, Captain Chin. I love you too, Mr. Chin. And just so you know, I filed a formal complaint with the state HOA Oversight Board yesterday. Margaret's going to have some real problems to deal with soon. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a text message. Then another, then another. I looked at the screen and started laughing. What? Sarah asked. It's from Tom Peterson, 3 cabins down. He says he heard about this morning and he wants to know if you'd be willing to help him fight his HOA violations too. I kept reading. And this one's from Lisa Chong. And, oh wow, this one's from Bradley Henderson. Margaret's son. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What does he want? I read the message aloud. Mrs. Chin, I heard what happened this morning. I've been trying to get my mother to resign from the HOA board for 2 years. She's made this community miserable for everyone. If you're serious about taking legal action, I have documentation of everything she's done. Also, thank you for your service and welcome to the neighborhood. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. You know what? I think I'm going to like living here. Over the next few weeks, our quiet mountain community transformed. Sarah's research had opened the floodgates, and it turned out that Margaret had been terrorizing our neighbors for years. People who'd been afraid to speak up started coming forward with their own stories of harassment and bogus citations. Sarah organized everything with military precision. She created committees, established communication networks, and developed action plans. Watching her work was like seeing a master strategist in her element, except instead of planning military operations, she was organizing a suburban rebellion. The state HOA Oversight Board's investigation was swift and thorough. Margaret was removed from her position, and several of her decisions were reversed. More importantly, the community came together in a way it never had before. We started having actual neighborhood barbecues instead of just HOA violation hearings. Margaret herself seemed almost relieved to be free of her self-imposed duties. Without the stress of trying to control everything and everyone around her, she turned out to be a fairly reasonable person. She even apologized to Sarah properly, and while they'd never be best friends, they developed a civil relationship based on mutual respect. But the real change was in Sarah. For the first time since coming home from her last deployment, she had a mission that mattered to her. She'd found a way to use her skills and training to help people, to make a real difference in a community that was now truly ours. "You know," she said one evening as we sat on our porch watching the sunset, "I was worried about coming home. About finding my place in civilian life. And now." She smiled, and it was the first completely relaxed smile I'd seen from her since she'd gotten back. "Now I think home isn't just a place. It's what you build with the people you choose to fight for." I looked around at our neighborhood, really looked at it. Kids were playing in yards where they used to be afraid of making too much noise. Neighbors were talking to each other instead of reporting each other. American flags flew at full height, and wind chimes sang in the mountain breeze. "So what's next, Captain?" Sarah grinned and pulled out a thick folder. "Well, I've been getting calls from other HOA communities in the area. Apparently, word is spreading about the suburban military strategist who takes down neighborhood tyrants." I laughed. "Is that your new mission?" "Someone has to fight for the little guy," she said, settling into my arms. "Might as well be someone who knows how to win." As the stars came out over Pine Ridge, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed in just a few weeks. Margaret's aggressive confrontation had backfired spectacularly, but more than that, it had given Sarah something she desperately needed: a sense of purpose, a way to serve her community, and the knowledge that her skills and experience had value beyond the battlefield. The HOA Karen who'd tried to drive us out had inadvertently created the very thing she'd been trying to prevent: a strong, united community where everyone belonged. And at the center of it all was my wife, the woman who'd traded one kind of service for another, proving that sometimes the best way to win a war is to help everyone else find peace. 3 months later, Sarah was elected president of the Pine Ridge HOA in a landslide victory. Her first official act was to eliminate all violation notices for flag sizes. Her second was to establish a community garden where Mrs. Patterson could grow the vegetables that Margaret had once tried to ban as non-aesthetic agricultural usage. And on quiet evenings, when Margaret walked past our cabin on her evening stroll, she always waved. Sometimes she even stopped to chat about the weather or ask about Sarah's work with the other communities. It turned out that underneath all that HOA fury, she was just a lonely widow who'd gotten too used to wielding the only power she had. Sarah never forgot the lesson of that morning, though. Power without purpose is just tyranny. But power used to protect and serve others? That's what makes a community worth fighting for. And every morning when I wake up next to my wife in our little cabin, with its perfectly regulation-sized flag flying proudly in our front yard, I'm reminded that sometimes the best battles are the ones fought not with weapons, but with knowledge, courage, and the unshakable conviction that everyone deserves to feel safe and welcome in the place they call home.